Hi, welcome to Community Buzz. Be Happy, Episode 1, the introduction. I'm Peter Roper. Our guest tonight is George Zvara, who's on his way to becoming a master beekeeper. Thanks, George, for sharing your knowledge about bees. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
Start out by telling us how you got into beekeeping and why you got into beekeeping, I guess.
Well, as it turns out, it was at a bookstore. I found a book called The ABC XYZ of Beekeeping. It's actually, the edition I picked up was written in 1949, but the book goes back into the late part of the 19th century. And it's sort of a running encyclopedia of beekeeping. I found it to be kind of interesting, bought it for $1, put it in the library, and then every now and then I would rediscover it, as it were. And then about 4 years ago, some reason I was looking for another hobby, as it were. And serendipitously, a secretary at work whose father was moving to Florida had to get rid of his beehives. He couldn't move to Florida and pick up the bees and bring the bees down. So he sold me 2 hives and all the equipment for an extremely reasonable price, and I brought him.
That's a good start.
So I brought him to the backyard in November, and of course they died over the wintertime. So thus that was lesson number 1.
Yep. That's how you get started, and that's how you find out how it's going to go.
Right.
So it's really not a business, it's a hobby for you.
Well, right, it's a hobby. And as I said, I've been doing it for about 4 years now, and the longer I get into it and do it, the more fascinating I find these creatures. What they do, just their lifestyle, as it were, their roles and responsibilities and duties, and how important they are as part of nature. They are one of our most important pollinators. And pollination is important for food sources and food supplies that we have here.
Yeah. And as you know, I did do a little beekeeping. I'm not at your level at all, but I enjoyed the bees, and it was an interesting hobby, so I can see why you got drawn into it, but it's not easy.
No.
Quickly, let's just talk about what a honeybee looks like, because there are bees, there are wasps, there are hornets, there are yellow jackets, bumblebees, Africanized bees. You know, there are a lot of different things out there that people usually are afraid of. Right. Honeybees are probably the least aggressive and the least dangerous of the bunch.
Absolutely. Honeybees are actually very tame. And people confuse honeybees with yellow jackets. Yeah. They look the same to a trained eye, and it's easily to train the eye. The yellow jackets are slightly smaller, and the yellow is slightly more yellowy, as it were.
They're really yellow and black.
Yeah, they are. Right.
Honeybees are more of a golden.
Exactly, Peter. They're a little bit larger and a little bit more of a golden. And most importantly, on yellow jackets, they bury in the ground, and that's where their nests are. And they actually die during the wintertime, but the queen will survive for the next season. And so what people tend to do is they accidentally disturb the hive that's in the ground by walking on the lawn, or they're doing the lawn with the lawnmower and such. Honeybees, contrastingly, they live in the hives. They live in trees, and they're above ground level. Yeah.
Or in barns or houses.
Right, on barns. Swarms, when the colony will divide itself, will find a new home, sometimes in an unwanted location, but by and large, they're docile. It's only when you disturb the hive they become a little bit more defensive.
Yep. And usually whacking at them is worse.
Well, right, because particularly if you're wearing dark clothes, then they think you're a predator.
Or perfume.
They
do have a sense of that.
Right.
And the other thing about bees, which makes them less likely to sting you, is they die in the process. They lose their stinger and they die.
Exactly.
Yellow jackets are repetitive. Hornets, most other things, will sting you more than once.
Exactly. With the honeybee, the stinger has a barb at the end, and so once it will sacrifice itself to sting you for the protection of the hive. Right. But once it inserts the stinger in you and attempts to fly away, the barb prevents the barb will prevent the stinger from coming out of the skin, and so what will happen is you'll retain the barb in you. Contrastingly to a yellow jacket, they can sting multiple times. They don't have that barb.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's enough about that, I think. But I wanted to make sure we get that in, because a lot of people lump any flying, stinging insect together, or they talk about them biting.
Right. No, they don't bite. Honeybees don't bite. They sting.
And honeybees lately have been in the news quite a bit, and I wanted to talk about their importance and why they are important to humans, because they're not just a cute little hobby. They're actually pretty important.
Well, absolutely. They're important for a primary reason. They are a major pollinator for all our produce and fruit foods. 1/3 of all the foods that we eat, all the produce that we eat, is pollinated by bees. 1/3. That's 1 out of every 3 mouthfuls. 1 out of every
So that's
3
orchards,
dinners.
gardens,
Orchards and gardens,
and even flowers.
and flowers and nuts. All of the almonds, in California. And California has about 80% of the world's supply of almonds. All those almonds have to be pollinated by bees. They're not self-pollinating. And so there's this whole sub-industry of beekeeping, as it were, of bringing millions of hives into the state of California to pollinate the almond groves.
And that's when beekeeping gets to be a business, when they actually are doing that on that level.
Exactly.
They're moving hives. And
They're moving
have a lot
hives,
of hives.
and if one was inclined, would make a business of supplying pollination services. There's a pollination contract. Also, clearly for the honey harvest, you can sell that, and also wax. You can take the wax from the combs in the hives, and you can sell that and market that as that. But for me, it's a hobby, and I have no interest of taking any further. But back to the importance of bees. They're pollinators. They're under threat from various sources these days, man-made and natural sources. But they are a major factor in successful food production in the United States, and they're under threat these days.
Could you talk a little bit about the economics and how important bees are economically, like in Connecticut, for instance? I know there's...
Well, yeah, there's, I don't have the figures at the top of my head, but it's orchards, apple orchards and such. We have several in town, of course, as you know, and they need those pollinators to pollinate those blossoms every year. And then, of course, we have the vegetable gardens and such. But the figures for Connecticut, I don't have at the top of my head, but when we're talking about bees in general across the United States, they're extremely important. Farmers need them. And right now, they're under great risk because of insecticides and pesticides, and also because of a type of farming that is industrial, where only one type of food source, or one type of grain, or one type of plant is being grown on a massive scale. Bees need pollen from multiple sources to be fully healthy. And so if they're in a location that is just this monolithic one crop, then they're in trouble. And then the other component
And it's probably more likely that would have pesticides on it too.
Exactly.
People are farming that way, they're usually using pesticides.
Right. And so we've, much like other things in life, there's the, or through the ecology, there's the insecticide-pesticide issue that we have here. That affects the bees. The pollen source and the monolithic crop production. It's not a problem in Connecticut, but when you go to the Midwest, major farms, commercial, really industrialized farms. And then finally, a major issue is a natural parasite that the bees get called the varroa mite. And the varroa mite was introduced somehow in the United States. We don't know how it was. It was introduced from Asia, originally comes from Asia, into the United States in around 1980s or so. And it's the size of a pinhead, like a large pinhead, and they're red, and they attach themselves to the body of the bee. And what they do is they drill through.
We do have some pictures now. Should we?
Sure.
Let's look pictures if we can.
Let's look at the photos. Right. And so what we see here is those red dots there, and you see about 4 or 5 of them. And Peter, they're on a larvae. That white cloud-looking thing is a baby bee. It's the pupa, actually.
So that's in a wax chamber, looking down onto a wax chamber.
Right. So that's a wax. That's a honeycomb cell, and that's where one of the babies go. And right there, you've got a larvae, and you can see those mites are just all over that pupa there. And so the mites actually will mate inside that cell.
So these are male, female mites?
Yeah, well,
or not.
right. Well, let me back up. The female will go into the cell, will lay eggs, and will then exit. The eggs will hatch, brother and sister. They will mate in the cell, and then the cell will eventually get capped by the bees. Upon mating, the male will die, and then the female will survive. The female baby mite will survive to be the next generation. And so there's a photo of those mites that are attacking the larvae, and we have another photo we call a pharenic mite, and that's a mite that's in the open, and it's attached to the body of the bee, and you can see it just above the thorax there.
About a third of the way down from the head down.
Right,
on its
right.
back.
That oval, reddish oval thing. And so, right, it's hanging on, drilling its way through the body of the bee. And then we have one more photo here, which I think is pretty interesting, and that's a photo of a queen. And this is an interesting photo for a couple of reasons, Peter. One is that's the queen, so you can see she's slightly elongated. Her abdomen is longer. The attender bees are all facing her, so they're all attending her, as it were. And then at the crown, at the top of her there, you can see the mite that's sitting on her crown there. So even the queen, and there's only one queen in a hive. In this photo here, even that mite is attacking the queen, which is not good because the queen is really the centerpiece of the hive for its health.
Yeah. And how does this actually work? They burrow into the...
Yeah, the bee will have a chitinous exoskeleton, as it's called, much like one's fingernail is made out of chitin. Well, that's a protective shell for the bee, and what will happen is the mite will drill into it, sucking some fluids out of the bee. That will weaken the bee, but more importantly, it will allow viruses to now enter that exposed area, and so the bee is now exposed to, its defenses are compromised, and now diseases and viruses and such can now attack the bees. And this happens not just on a solitary bee, but happens in thousands of bees throughout the hive.
So it happens to the whole hive.
It happens to the whole hive, right.
So initially, where do they come from?
They came from Asia. They actually lived in harmony with an Asian bee, and that Asian bee was able to handle this mite business. And somehow it came into America, like I said, in the mid-'80s or so.
And we were talking the other day about the article, the Russian bees actually pull the mites off each other?
Right. And certain strains of bees, particularly the Russian bee, they have come up with their own defenses for the mites. And there are different strains of bees when you get into beekeeping. There's Italian and Carnolian and Russian and such. And they all have different traits. The Russian trait is such that they can better handle the mites, but not 100%. So they're not mite-proof, as it were, but they can better handle it. There's some genetic research going on to try to breed better types of bees that can handle this threat. But when you're a beekeeper, you have to medicate the hives. You have to go in there, insert yourself in the process, and undertake medication protocols, so that you have to kill these bees. You treat them, right?
And that doesn't hurt the bees?
No. No, the treatments that is common in the practice are based upon natural acids, formic acid, oxalic acid, and the like. And these are toxic to the mites, but they're not toxic to the bees. So they are chemicals, but they're natural chemicals. But they're natural chemicals under high concentrations. And so you have to administer the medication with some care. So you wear some gloves and in cases, respiratory. Well, some face protection. So it's nothing drastic, as it were, but you have to insert yourself for the benefit of the hive and the health of the hive. You have to handle these mites.
And that has to be done fairly early on before the hive is totally infested.
Exactly. It's you do some preventative treatment, and then there are protocols to take to determine how affected the hive is in terms of the mite infestation, and then you do additional treatments. It's usually done twice a year. By applying certain pads that contain these acids.
When I asked where the bees come from, how do they get into the hive initially? I mean, do they come on other bees, or is it just
the mites?
Yeah.
Mites. The mites. Well, bees will sort of cross, I don't say pollinate, but will interact with other hives, and they will bring those mites back into the hive unwantedly. But it's just there's varroa everywhere, and so when you're beekeeping in the United States, you're dealing with this problem. Only rare places in North America are mite-free. I think some of the maritime provinces in Canada I've read are mite-free. Fortunate for them, and they're very. Rightfully so, they're very concerned about other bees coming in that could be at risk, bringing mites into those provinces.
And are these mites specific to bees only?
Yeah,
There's no
yeah.
life cycle with
Right,
other
right,
insects? or
right.
anything?
They're specific to bees, but not only to honeybees. So the mason bee that you see, the bumblebee, the solitary bee, which we haven't talked about, but that's
Yeah.
another important pollinator. These are the fatter bees, as it were, kind of,
Yeah.
we just call them bumblebees and such. They're also important
They're
pollinators.
fuzzy, lighter yellow and black.
Right, sometimes
as
they're
opposed
black.
to the,
Right, right. There may be
the yellow jackets, which are skinnier
right
and bright yellow.
elongated. Right,
Yeah,
right.
smoother.
Well, these bumblebees will also be affected by the mites.
Ah,
But they're solitary, so bumblebees don't live in a colonial
Yeah, so it's just
framework.
one.
Right.
and I assume economically this is a really big deal to
Yeah,
beekeepers. and-
yeah, it is. I mean, you can easily lose your hives
Yeah.
to these mites left untreated.
The other thing, pesticides you talked about, how does that affect the hive? I mean,
Well, what happens is bees go out and forage, and we know many people would like to have very pristine lawns and use pesticides to remove ants and other perceived unwanted insects and critters and such, as well as weed control and that business. Well, bees forage. Bees will go out and they're working, bringing home
if
nectar.
it's on the plants, it gets on the bees.
Right, it gets on the plants and the bees bring it back home. And what happens, Peter, is that over the course of time, these concentrations of pesticides continually to increase and are compounded as over time. The hive acts as sort of an integrator, as it were.
Concentrator, yeah.
Right, concentrator, exactly. So, yeah, the insecticide problem is a major issue.
I think that was one of the problems I had. I had a feeling that my hive got weaker and
Yeah.
died, and then I had to start over, and then it happened again, and finally it was.
Right. There's not really much one can do for the insecticide component. I mean, when you keep bees, it's not a sort of, keep it and forget it. You have to, every week or so, you go in there and you inspect the hive, see how the queen is doing in terms of laying her eggs, and whether the next generation of bees are being laid and properly cared for and such, and more or less the health of the hive.
Yeah.
It's not very difficult, but like a pet, as it were, you have to take care of them.
Yeah. And what is the mysterious colony collapse disorder?
That
We didn't really talk about that.
Right, yeah, CCD. That is still, it is mysterious. We don't know why that happens, but what the manifestations are is that a colony that appears to be healthy one day leaves. It absconds. It just leaves the hive. It leaves the babies behind. It leaves the food source behind.
So it's different from a swarm.
Exactly.
Maybe we should talk about a swarm. 'Cause we
Right,
didn't really talk about that.
right. A swarm is a natural tendency of the bee to.
It's really a splitting of the hive.
Right, right. It's a natural tendency of the hive to reproduce itself as a community. And so it will say, I've outgrown my environment, my hive here, I need to reproduce as a collective. And so a process will undertaken where they'll start raising separate queens. They will then they will not feed the mother queen to reduce her weight so she can fly. And then at some appointed time, half the colony will fly off with the old mother queen to bivouac somewhere to look for a new home, leaving younger bees to tend the broods that were there, and also to tend to the new queen that will emerge. And so the hive, as a collective, will split, and that's all part of nature, and that's all in part of the fascinating component of beekeeping, of just the things that are going on.
It's really the hive is really an organism.
Well,
in
you
many
realize,
ways.
exactly, Peter, you realize it's not, as much as every bee is important, as it were, really, at the end of the day, the hive is the organism. The hive, the collective, is the most important part. And bees will recognize that. Bees will sacrifice themselves for the safety of the collective.
Which is why you don't mess around with a hive.
Right. And they will also kill the queen. When the queen is perceived not to be as fertile as she needs to be, they will kill her to replace her. So it's a tough world in there, and you realize it's not the individual bee per se, but the collective that's important, the hive.
So have you experienced all of these problems?
Well, fortunately, yes, the mites. Yes, I have
Mites you
mites.
have.
And mites are there, and I undertake the medication that needs to. I did believe I had a CCD, a colony collapse disorder. I came back from Thanksgiving vacation one year to discover a healthy hive to be gone, and I was stumped by that. And in terms of the pesticides and insecticides business, I really don't know, to be honest with you, because you really need to bring that to a laboratory.
Because your bees cover how much of an area?
Well, good question. A bee can forage 3 miles. So radius, that's a 3-mile radius. So I forget how many acres that is, but
The chances of pesticides in that radius
exactly,
are pretty high.
Exactly, which brings us into
people are pretty willy-nilly about using it, not thinking about it.
Right, and so along those lines, when you start thinking about it, talk about organic farming and organic honey. Well, you have no control where the bee forages, and honey is made from what they forage from, the nectar. And so, unless you got that hive in an orchard, that's organic and it's 3 miles in radius, then you may not be assured of organic honey. So,
and there is actually a difference in flavor in the honey depending on what flowers they're.
Right. It's more discernible in my view. It's more discernible in the South when. You have bees that are working, as it were, orchards. So they'll bring bees down to pollinate the orange blossoms. And so the bees will go down and pollinate them for several weeks. And the nectar that they bring back, which they'll make into honey, will have that tinge of orange flavor to it. Tupelo honey in Mississippi is also popular, and other variants, clover honey. But you really have no control of what flowers the bee go to. So the honey that I make here, it's notionally called wildflower honey, right? So it's sort of a generic name.
Yeah. And they collect from when to when? They're collecting
excuse me,
food.
Depends on where you are in geography in New England, here, southeastern Connecticut.
I was talking about you, your bees.
Oh, my bees, right. So the nectar flow here will be early May. From May to, say, July, we'll have some nectar flowing. And that's when the beekeeper will put on equipment to capture honey or nectar that will be made into honey for human consumption. The nectar flow stops around July or so, and so then you'd have to feed the bees because there's a dearth of nectar. So you feed them some sugar water, and then it picks up for later in the season. Say late August to September is the second nectar flow, and so you can have another honey harvest, as it were, in up to September. And then after that, middle to late September, then the hive, then you have to take care of the hive and prepare it for winter. And what that means is you feed it sugar water. You want to make sure that those honeybees have a lot of honey, about 100 pounds of honey per hive. You want those bees.
So you consciously leave honey for the bees and take a little for yourself.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Sometimes you don't take any for yourself.
If your bees don't have enough to get them through the winter, you don't take any honey. So that's their fuel for the wintertime. They don't forage. They need that fuel to survive and also to generate heat, because that's the only heating mechanism. They twitch, they get together in a tight ball mass, and they twitch around. And regardless as to the ambient temperature, Peter, it could be 0 degrees outside, they'll keep that queen at around 90 degrees. And that's all done with.
You said the hive during the winter is a unit. They have to move the food to stay warm.
Right.
And they could freeze with food in the hive.
Exactly.
Right?
And so they need a certain minimum number of bees. They need to be clustered together, and they move as a ball mass, all as a unit,
where the honey
looking for the honey. And they could be inches away from a big pocket of honey and not find it.
So long periods of really freezing weather is not good.
Well,
I assume.
Well, they can handle the cold. It can handle the cold as long as they have a good number of bees. A large number of bees for them to generate the heat, and enough fuel of food supply. And you help them out by putting some insulation around the hive, and I wrap my hives with tar paper, staple tar paper around it to get some ambient radiant heating on it. So and some other things. And so there's not a lot of work to do in the wintertime, but the bees can take care of themselves as long as they have enough food, and there's enough of them to keep themselves warm.
Great. Well, let's talk about what our viewers can do about this. If they're inspired after hearing your description here, what do you recommend people do to help the situation with bees?
Well, one is...
How can someone be bee friendly?
Right, bee friendly, right. Well, that's great. Bees need our help. They need everyone's help. And so there's about 3 things a concerned citizen can do. One is to reduce the use of pesticides and insecticides. Just try to live I don't want to say organically, but
Especially during that collecting period. I'm
yeah,
thinking if they weren't spraying then, it would be a big help.
right. During the nectar flow is important, but by and large at all times.
At all times,
These are toxins. These are toxins to insects, and bees, and bees are part of that. And you're putting the bees to risk. Putting the bees to risk, you're putting our food supply at risk. Remember, back at the end of the day, they're our pollinators for
Everybody's
1/3 of our
garden,
foods.
everybody's
right?
orchard.
The other thing a concerned citizen can do is plant bee-friendly flowers. So flowers that have lots of pollen in them. Clover's good. I like to keep dahlias, as you know, and certain dahlias have some pollen in the core, and there are bees always on top of that. Nothing's prettier than a beautiful dahlia with a couple bees working the pollen. It's just a nice picture of nature in your backyard. So plant bee-friendly flowers.
Any other landscaping type things that would be bee-friendly?
Fresh water. Bees need water.
But I was thinking landscaping bushes or trees?
Well,
or
no, I think it's really, what they
More the
need is,
flowering
they need nectar from flowers and pollen from flowers. To get the pollen will also come from certain trees, but the flowers help them with the nectar. And the other thing a concerned citizen can do, and I would encourage all to consider that, is to keep a beehive. Is to get into the hobby, as it were, and look into it. And now is the time, if I may say, in late fall, early winter. The season, as it were, picks up in April, and there are things, if you're really interested in beekeeping, there are things you should be thinking about now and planning for it. So there's planning for the equipment that you need to purchase. We call woodenware. This is the hive boxes and all this other business. And then the other part is getting the bees. You want to you would place order with bees for delivery in say April. You place these orders with suppliers now. Roughly, they're taking orders now. And the point is, by say January, many of these suppliers will fill up and will close their sales to people. So everything comes together in around April and May. Your equipment will come in, your bees will come in, you put them both together, and you can start spring with beautiful bees in your backyard.
Great. Well, I would say you're pretty inspiring, because I think hopefully someone watches this will think about doing it. And you said there were how many beekeepers in Connecticut?
Well, yeah, you're being asked to register your hives with the state of Connecticut. It doesn't cost you anything. It's really more for the state to take a head count, as it were. And so in Connecticut, when I last checked, there's about 600 beekeepers total, with almost 4,000 hives. But there's only 4 beekeepers registered in Groton.
And 2 of them we know are on our street.
And 2 of them are on our street, Peter. That's right. And one of them sitting right here.
Yep.
So I would encourage my my fellow citizens in southeastern Connecticut to consider beekeeping. It's a fun hobby.
Beekeepers are a helpful group, so you can get help from other beekeepers if you need it too. And actually, you should plan on watching episode 2 of this series, because we're going to do a basic beekeeping program with George, some of which already has been filmed, so that should be coming up soon. So watch this station for schedule of that. Thank you, George, very much for
Peter.
doing the beekeeping, number 1.
Well, how kind.
And for sharing it with us, number 2, because I think it's an interesting topic. Obviously, I did it once, so
Right.
I'm really interested in it.
Right.
But it's great information, and hopefully we inspired a few people and at least made people aware of how important it is. We'll see you in episode 2.
Peter?
And thank you, viewers, for watching Community Buzz. Be good to your environment and be well. Thanks.